All right, Alexander, let's once again talk about MBS and some new revelations that you have for us. MBS, and he got into a little, maybe a big scuffle with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and he really pissed off Russia big time. You have this news for us. And you also have some news that it looks like MBS may be on his way out, maybe. But anyway, get into the story because he's pissed off everybody. Russia, US, people inside the kingdom. I mean, the guy's just skating on some very thin ice at the moment.
Absolutely. Alex, this information that we've now had about MbS, which I think is absolutely, dynamite, it comes from Middle East Eye, which is one of the top, sites that covers Middle East news. And this is a very reliable, extremely well-informed site covering Middle East news. And it's well known that it gets a lot of information from the US authorities. And when I say the U.S. authorities, I mean people within, not just the government, but people who are connected to Saudi Arabia. It's also known that it is very, very very close to some people within the Saudi elite also. So it's extremely well informed. It's well known for being extremely reliable. It doesn't mean, by the way, that it doesn't have particular agendas, but that doesn't mean that we're talking about a outfit that we shouldn't trust what they factually say. And what they say is, and it comes back to to the many discussions we've had about the price war, is what they say is about the origins of the Saudi price war, this extraordinary war that the Saudis launched in March of this year, when after the failure of a meeting of OPEC Plus in Vienna on the 6th of March, they went around flooding the world, saying they were going to flood the world with oil and cutting the prices of oil to an extraordinary degree. And that caused stock markets around the world to crash, and eventually caused the oil price itself to crash. And if you remember, at that time, there were all kinds of clever articles written by all sorts of people saying that it was all part of some great plot by Vladimir Putin to wreck the US oil industry and to destabilize the world financial system and all that. And we said in the Duran, this absolutely wasn't true. The person who was driving all of this was clearly MbS. It was MbS who was flooding the world with oil. It was MbS who was cutting prices. The entire oil price war was clearly his idea. Well, Middle East Eye has now provided us with resounding confirmation of this, but it goes much, much further than that. In fact, it's almost the least of it, because it turns out that on the eve of this disastrous OPEC Plus summit, which took place in Vienna on the 6th of March, which was the event which led to the Saudis launching the oil price war. MbS picked up the phone and called Vladimir Putin. This is a telephone conversation none of us has known about. The Kremlin up to now has never reported it. And it turns out that the two men had a blazing row. When I say a blazing row, the way it is being described is an absolute shouting match, with MbS shouting, trying to shout Putin down, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, trying to shout down Putin, and in the end, giving Putin an ultimatum that unless Russia agreed to the kind of production cuts that MbS wanted, the Saudis would launch their oil price war. Vladimir Putin did what Vladimir Putin always does. He never accepts ultimatums. He will never accept that kind of behavior from anybody. He apparently told MbS to take a running jump and put the phone down. So that was the event that precipitated the price war. Now, it shows, to my mind, a number of things. It confirms yet again what a fiery, impulsive, spoiled, reckless, ridiculous, clownish figure MbS is. If he thinks that that is the way to conduct diplomacy with President Putin, Vladimir Putin, one of the world's most powerful men, he is a complete ignoramus. That's one thing. The second thing that it shows is, again, who is obviously responsible for this? Well, we already knew that. But the third thing, and it explains an awful lot about what has happened since, is that the Russians, after that conversation, have completely frozen him out. We had noticed and mentioned in previous videos that it was striking how Putin, from this point on, started to telephone King Salman, the head of state of Saudi Arabia, MbS's father, rather than MbS himself, and the extent to which Putin seemed to have cut the Saudis completely out, or at least MbS completely out, and was only talking to them when Donald Trump was asking him to, and when Donald Trump was involved in the cause. So not only has MbS again displayed his utterly reckless and irresponsible behavior, he has also completely burnt his bridges with the Russians, which was the one major country with which up to then he was still on good terms. So once again, we have an example of MbS making a total mess, and he has lost now one of his key friends.
All right, so we called this right from the get-go, and people in the U.S. now are starting to see what's going on, kind of. They still have Russia mixed into this oil price war, and they're still blaming it, yes, on Saudi Arabia, but they're also saying that Russia wanted to destroy U.S. shale. But let me read you two tweets, Alexander, and one title from Zero Hedge, which is a good example on this, and you can comment afterwards. The title from Zero Hedge was Kyle Bass, the Saudis are sending us a 50 million barrel oil bomb. Kyle Bass, of course, is the well-known hedge fund manager, American hedge fund manager, and he tweeted this about what's going on. The Saudis and Russians have declared war against U.S. shale energy companies, the Saudis and Russians. It seems they weren't happy with American energy independence. Storage full, largest glut in history. Saudis are sending us a 50 million barrel oil bomb. How negative will June crude go? And then you had this tweet the other day from Senator Ted Cruz. 20 tankers filled with 40 million barrels of Saudi oil are headed to the U.S. This is 7 times the typical monthly flow. At the same time, oil futures are plummeting and millions of U.S. jobs in jeopardy. My message to the Saudis: turn the tankers the hell around. That's all in caps, Alexander. Turn the tankers the hell around. Interesting that Ted Cruz only said my message to the Saudis, but you do have hedge fund managers, well-known hedge fund managers like Kyle Bass, who are still saying Saudis and Russians started this oil price war. Alexander, your comments.
Well, of course, I mean, some people in the United States just can't get the idea that Russia isn't out to get them out of their heads. But let's put that to one side. A couple of weeks ago, about a week ago, I was talking about 7 Saudi oil tankers that filled up with 40 million barrels of oil heading for the US. We now realize it's many more than that, and that this wave of oil that MbS has launched against the US is much, much greater. I mean, we're now talking about 40 to 50 million barrels of oil. This is a titanic amount of oil. Bear in mind that oil consumption around the world is usually roughly 100 million barrels of oil a day. So, I mean, you know, this is just, I mean, this is off the scale what MbS is up to. Now, I had assumed after the OPEC Plus agreement of last week that those super tankers that MbS had sent steaming towards the US with all that oil were turning back. It turns out no such thing. And this is the other thing I wanted to say. Yes, MbS had this monstrous flaming row with Putin, but it's absolutely clear that he had been planning this all along, because all that oil doesn't just come out of nowhere. He'd clearly been stockpiling it for months and probably years for the day when he would launch it. And you don't just conjure up super tankers out of nowhere. I mean, I know people, I'm sure you know people, we're Greeks after all, who work in the shipping industry. This is a big thing to, hire super tankers and to send them. So, I mean, this has clearly been a scheme he has been plotting for a long time. And it is clearly directed at his American friends. He set out to destroy the US shale oil industry, exactly as Putin said. Now, he won't succeed. The United States regards its energy industry as a strategic industry, and they will do everything they possibly can to preserve it. He won't succeed, but what he is doing is he's going to wreck his relations with the US. He's wrecked his relations with the Russians. The Russians have apparently now pulled a major arms deal they were going to do for Saudi Arabia. They were going to supply Saudi Arabia with sophisticated air defense systems to protect their oil installations from drone attacks of the sort that we saw last year. They're not going to do that, it seems now. They're that angry with MbS. And people like Ted Cruz and powerful people in the US are absolutely furious as they see this man, this clown prince, as he's now increasingly called, their so-called friend, setting out to destroy one of their key strategic industries. Now, in a world where you are making enemies of both the Russians and the Americans, and where you depend upon the United States for your survival, because to be very clear, without the guarantee that the US gives to the Saudi royal family, it's very, very difficult to see how the Saudis can continue to rule Saudi Arabia in the way they have been doing, where you have antagonized both the Russians and the Americans. What future do you have?
What future does he have, Alexander?
I would say none at all. Now, I don't want to rush ahead. I'm not someone who is familiar with the internal politics of Saudi Arabia, an impossible subject for any outsider to be really familiar with. But I cannot help but believe that the princes in Saudi Arabia are becoming extremely worried about this whole situation and about the way MbS is leading the country and leading it basically to disaster. And the princes have acted in the past very decisively to protect their positions. And I would have thought that before very long, we will be seeing petitions to the king in which they will say that MbS is clearly unfit to rule, and the king is asked to downgrade him from his position as crown prince at the very least, with the threat of further action if that doesn't happen. I would add that this article, which has appeared in Middle East Eye, bears every sign of having been leaked to Middle East Eye by the Saudi royal family, by insiders within the Saudi Arabian royal family. And that must be seen as somebody in Saudi Arabia preparing the ground for a strike against MbS. There have been coups of this kind in Saudi Arabia before. In the early 1960s, the king, King Saud, who was at that time seen by the princes as mismanaging the affairs of the kingdom, was deposed, and his brother was put in his place. And unless MbS completely changes course, I can't see how he can do that. I predict that that's what's going to happen. And there will be people in Washington and Moscow who will not only be very pleased to see it happen, they will do what they can to facilitate it.
All right, I'm still having a hard time trying to understand MbS's logic here. Why the hell would he want to go after the United States shale market? I mean, okay, there's the competition aspect, but he must know that his existence, his being on this planet hinges on how the U.S. feels about him. Period. Period. So why would he do this reckless move? Is there something more to this? Is this attack? Is this an attack on the petrodollar? Is this an attack on Donald Trump? What is the logic behind this man's thinking?
I'll tell you exactly what I think the logic is, and it all stems from his absolutely grandiose and insane and reckless plan to try and leverage the assets, the value of Saudi Aramco, in order to fund some massive industrialization program in Saudi Arabia. Now, he tried, as we know, to do an IPO for Saudi Aramco at the start of this year. That was a complete failure. People were not prepared to buy. The international investment community was not prepared to buy shares in Saudi Aramco. He had to twist the arms of some of his relations to make up the numbers. And even then, they were much smaller than he'd expected or wanted. So, in order to goose up Saudi Aramco and make its its value much higher than the market otherwise makes it, he tried to smash the shale oil industry so that he would reposition Saudi Arabia once again as the kind of big swing producer that it was in the 70s and 80s, at which point, of course, Saudi Aramco would be worth much more, and he would be able to sell those shares at a possible good price. And he tried to cover his position with the Americans by telephoning Jared Kushner before he had that call with Putin, told Jared Kushner that he was going to call Putin and give Putin an ultimatum. Then he called Putin, staged this bizarre and reckless quarrel, and then told the international media that it's not I who launched the price war, it's the Russians. In other words, it was a cunning and it was a stupid plan, a stupid cunning plan. We call it we say in England a cunning plan when we really mean a stupid plan by a boy far over his head. He thought he could fool the Americans. He thought he could manipulate the Russians, and it's blown up in his face.
All right, I think it's becoming clear that MbS is on borrowed time. I think the U.S. and Trump will dispose of him one way or another, or the kingdom will dispose of him in order to appease the United States.
All of these people together.
Right. He spoke with Kushner, MbS. We know that there's a special relationship, an unspoken special relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Will Israel allow the U.S. to dispose of MbS?
In a word, yes. At the end of the day, and I think this is one of the points people always get wrong about this relationship, the United States will act to defend its own interests. I know people constantly go on about Israel, but I think when people in the United States set the future of the US oil industry against whatever concerns Israel might have, they will set out to protect the US oil energy industry. It's far too important to the US to be sacrificed. And I'm going to say something else. Yes, they will get rid of MbS, but I predict that relations with Israel, between Israel and Saudi Arabia, will remain pretty much as they are. We might not have the ostentatious and obvious friendship that MbS has cultivated with Israel, but I don't really think anybody who succeeds or takes over in Saudi Arabia for the moment is going to change policy. So I think the US will act to protect its energy industry. I don't think they will lift a finger to help MbS if the Saudi royals move against him, which I predict they will. On the contrary, I expect them to give the green light for that to happen. And I don't think the Israelis will do anything to save MbS either. He has just antagonized too many people. And this year, he has made a complete and utter mess of things.
All right, I will throw one last thing at you, Alexander. Maybe getting rid of MbS, maybe weakening Saudi Arabia will strengthen Israel's position in the Middle East and Israel's position as an oil producing country, because we know very well that Israel anchors the entire East Med project. How does that sound to you?
Well, that's entirely possible. I mean, I'm going to say something. I mean, irrespective of what happens now, whether MBS stays or, as I expect, MBS goes, the internal stability of Saudi Arabia has now been undermined. If he stays, he will accelerate the instability and the eventual collapse of the country. If he goes, then it's one thing for the Saudis to carry out a coup against the king and his crown prince in the 60s when the kingdom was very stable. It's a completely different thing to do that today. Today, the situation in Saudi Arabia is much less certain, and that kind of power change is inevitably going to lead to increasing signs of instability in the country. So one way or the other, things in Saudi Arabia do not look good. And that, I would have thought, will benefit Israel. It won't just benefit Israel in terms of its position as an energy pivot, but it will benefit Israel's relationship with the United States, because with the Saudi prop of the US's alliance systems in the Middle East weakening, the US is bound to turn to the other stable and strong country which is its ally even more in the Middle East, even more, and that is Israel. So I can't see how Israel loses from this.
Yeah, maybe, just maybe, you may be seeing a shift, a pivot in how we look at energy in the Middle East, moving a little bit away from Saudi Arabia
Yeah.
and turning more towards the Eastern Mediterranean. Maybe.
Wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, I don't know that anybody has planned it that way. Well, some people may have done, but that may that's entirely plausible consequence of all of this. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest.
All right. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much, guys. If you like this video, click on that subscribe button down below. Smash that like button. Share this video with everybody you know, because YouTube will not share this video inside of their platform. So when you share the video, it really helps us out a lot. Also, donate to us on PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And you can also become a member of the Duran community via YouTube as well. You'll see the join button underneath the video. You can click that as well. That helps us out a whole lot. And go to the Duran shop and pick up some merchandise. We've got mugs, we've got polo shirts, all kinds of good things that will help your geopolitical IQ. Perhaps MbS should have been drinking out of our magic mugs before he decided to take on the US shale industry.
Absolutely. He certainly should have done. This man who is on this mug, who is Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, a geopolitician of genius and a man of tremendous realism, with an acute understanding of such things, would have advised him not to do the kind of reckless and stupid things that he has been doing. That is, by the way, why we have him on our mugs, because he is such a brilliant statesman and foreign policy specialist. I mean, he's the best foreign minister in the world, bar none. And this is the best magic mug in the world, bar none. In fact, it is an absolutely stupendous mug. It is a Duran mug, of which we have several types, and with all kinds of emblems and coats of arms on this. This one, as I said, has Sergei Lavrov. But each and every one of them is a wonderful Duran mug, and they are the best. I speak as the absolute #1 world expert on the subject of mugs, having had and drunk from scores and hundreds of them. These are the best mugs, I can say unequivocally, you will ever find. They are beautifully made. They're incredibly strong and light. They keep your tea or coffee hot. They keep your beer and champagne cold. They have a capacity to hold lots of each, and they are a joy to have to hold and handled. By the way, the other great thing about them is that I've had my mugs now for about a year and a half. I am a famously careless man, but you see that not a single one of them is broken or chipped or cracked or in any way discolored, which is a sign of how extremely strong and well made they are. So the best mugs in the world, and they're complemented by the best polo shirts in the world, including the one I'm wearing now, which is incredibly comfortable. It's 100% cotton. It is tremendously hard wearing. I've also had this shirt for well over a year now, and it is in perfect, pristine condition, and it is also phenomenally elegant and stylish. All of our shirts, not just our polo shirts, have, as you can see, the double-headed eagle of the Duran. And we don't just have polo shirts, we have t-shirts, long-sleeved and short-sleeved. We have v-neck shirts. All our shirts are of the same exceptional quality. And we also have, at the same standard of quality, hats and hoodies and stickers. And we also have our very, very good ebooks on topics like Russiagate, Ukrainegate, Brexit, and Epstein. And we also have a new ebook on precisely the subject that we have been talking about today, which is the oil situation. So come to the Duran, do what Alex says, support us. We depend on you for our support. Own these amazing and wonderful things, and Alex will tell you how.
You'll find a link to the Duran shop down below, theduranshop.com. Alexander Mercouris, thank you very much. Till next time, everybody, take care.